Hello and welcome to our Tips and Techniques videos. I'm Mark Biasotti and we are currently in our advanced modeling episodes. And over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be exploring how you can increase your skills using some of SolidWorks' more advanced features so that you can be more productive and create higher quality models. So whether you're a seasoned SolidWorks user or a beginner, we think that you'll learn something new in this series. For your convenience, we've listed the topics in the YouTube description that we'll be covering in today's episode, along with a timestamp for each topic in the video. Feel free to skip ahead to any tip or point you want to learn more about. This series is being brought to you by Spanner Product Development, a product development company dedicated to creating positive impact in the world, merging innovation, sustainability, and responsibility to bring meaningful experiences to life for over hundreds of clients. If you want to learn more about what Spanner has to offer, stop by our website at spannerpd.com or email us at hello@spannerpd.com. Now let's get started with this episode of our Advanced Modeling episodes.
Welcome to today's video episode of Advanced Tips and Techniques series. This is episode 20, SolidWorks Advanced Modeling, part 16. And in today's episode, we're going to take the road less traveled and talk about the subject of interaction between mechanical engineers and industrial designers. Now I know it's somewhat of an agnostic departure from the subject of MCAD, but nonetheless I thought it be an important subject if you're a product designer working in the consumer product space. And I know you've probably undoubtedly been paired with a mechanical engineer, product designer, or industrial designer to develop a product. I'll go as far as to say that perhaps some of you have struggled to work with your colleague of this opposite profession and have asked yourself, why is there division and divisiveness when we're all aiming towards the same end goal, a successful product design? Well, I thought it'd be important that as part of this series that I address this issue of multidisciplinary teams, namely the ME and ID working together. Now I realize that we also work with double E's, marketing, procurement, sales, but for the focus of this episode, I'll talk about the ME and the ID because they probably perhaps work the closest together in developing in the early stages of the product. So, so at the risk of generalizing or stereotyping each of these professions, I thought that I might have some insight on the subject since I've been practicing product design for more than 35 years and have done so in the capacity of both an industrial designer and a mechanical engineer. Now I'm comfortably aware that you may differ with my observations, but they are just my observations and your observations are valid too. And I think a great outcome of this episode would be to continue on the subject in dialogue so that we can all learn from one another and gain each other's observations. But I thought I'd get this started with this episode and maybe we can continue in a forum or whatever to talk more about it. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will refer to the mechanical engineer and the product designer as one and the same. That is the one who is responsible for executing the mechanical engineering of the product to production. And when I refer to the industrial designer, I'm suggesting that they are uniquely responsible for the concept of the design, but not its mechanical execution. And I also recognize that many of you are both playing the role of ME, ID, either partly or fully, assuming both those roles as one person. So I think it's fair to say that for some of you listening to this episode, you can resonate with the fragile relationship that exists between industrial designer and mechanical engineer. In large part, when the relationship becomes fragile, it is because these two disciplines have differing education, different contributions to the product development that lead them to lose sight of the ultimate goal, and that is a successful product. I think the key to making the relationship less fragile and more collaborative is to recognize the training, the strengths, and contributions of each discipline that are vital to the successful outcome. And without each other's contributions, you usually do not have a successful outcome. I'll finish up the episode by sharing some practical tools, practices, and observations that I've experienced over my career as both an industrial designer and a product designer. Okay, so why sometimes is it so hard to be in the position of an industrial designer? I think there isn't a better example of an industrial designer actually than Steve Jobs. He was essentially an industrial designer trapped inside a marketing engineer's body. He really had a unique background in dualism that drove him to conjure some of the best product designs we've had in this past century. And he probably understands the tension better than anybody between industrial design and product design. So, but in many cases, there is a divide between an engineer and designer that just doesn't want to understand or compromise, and then sometimes bullies their way through the design process. So on the other hand, there can be a divide between designer and engineer that takes a status quo approach, and they're reliant on their tried and true process, which can stifle innovation. So with that background, I thought I would take a moment to explore the roles and the contributions and relationship of both the mechanical engineer and the industrial designer. It could be said in a very generalized way that while an industrial designer explores what has not yet been proven to be possible, an engineer explores what they know is possible. Now, I'm not saying that an engineer never explores anything new. Rather, for the most part, they are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the mechanical functionality and viability of the product makes it through. So the role of an industrial designer ultimately is to add unique competitive value by way of innovation in function, in aesthetics, and in user experience. And the idea is trained in both art, science, and materials, but they have a focus towards beauty, harmony, simplicity, and order in how products look and how we interact with them. On the other hand, the role of a mechanical engineer is to execute on a product that is functional in operation and is manufacturable within an acceptable price point. The ME is usually trained in math, science, and chemistry, and their focus is on logic, function, order, and practicality through their experience and through learned empirical observation. In other words, in the face of innovation and its potential risks, the ME is responsible to deliver. So this all leads me to ponder, how can we better collaborate as ME and ID? And I submit to you that one sure way would be to get into each other's shoes a little bit so that we can better appreciate each other's respective roles. One way to do this would be to have our priorities towards actualizing each other's goal. So with a bit of wordsmithing, one could say an ME designs a product to function correctly, be manufacturable and cost-effective within a given price point in a way that is uniquely competitive in function, aesthetics, and user experience. And then likewise, an industrial designer designs a product that is uniquely competitive in function, aesthetics, and user experience in a way that functions correctly is manufacturable and cost effective at a given price point. If a ME and an ID can realize each other's goal and contributions are vital to the product's ultimate success, then they can better appreciate and embrace each other's role. Furthermore, a certain amount of crossover in roles could be beneficial. The most innovative industrial designers that I've known in my career are the ones that learn and build on their knowledge of mechanical engineering tools and manufacturing processes, and then leverage that for ID innovation. The most successful mechanical engineers I've observed are the ones that don't look down on IDs, but instead they admire them for their innovative thinking process. So, swinging back to the subject of mechanical engineering tools in this series, it would be beneficial for better collaboration between ME and ID to know a bit more about each other's MCAD tool of choice. SolidWorks is a tool that can be shared by both ME and ID alike, and I think perhaps the biggest single reason, in my opinion, for its phenomenal growth since its beginning. So if that's your situation, you're well on your way to an ideal ME ID collaboration because you share a common tool. For another segment of the ID world, Rhino and Alias and Fusion 360 is the tool of choice. And some of my ID clients, I've adopted a working knowledge of these tools, namely Rhino and somewhat Alias, so that I can be more successful collaborating with them when executing their design in SolidWorks, NX, or Creo. So, the reason for the popularity of Rhino and Alias particularly is that they are more capable Class A surface modelers than SolidWorks. And they're also less expensive and easier to use than NX or Creo. Although Creo and NX are capable surface modelers and even Class A surface modelers. Although I might take exception that with Alias, because it has a very deep menu structure and it is pretty difficult to learn. Of course, the simplicity of Rhino and Alias as primary surface modelers leads to their lack of manufacturing capability, and that's where SolidWorks takes up the slack to get it into production. So one of the ways that I incorporate Rhino into my workflow is that when I'm working with a client whose ID is working in Rhino, I collaborate with them in Rhino. And so I'll communicate my progress to them by sending them a Rhino file in which I've imported my SolidWorks. That way I see what the designer sees. And so when we're talking over issues, I'm taking notes of his issues as I see them, as he sees them in Rhino. In my experience doing this, I've come to really appreciate the level of surface analysis that exists in Rhino and that lacks in SolidWorks. So I'm going to just take a moment here to share with you a brief example of this, and I think you'll see what I mean. So if you've watched some of my previous episodes, you've seen the model of this tire pressure gauge, digital tire pressure gauge. And this is developed in SolidWorks using boundaries and fills. And from all appearances, it looks like a pretty sweet surface. Lots of, everything's tangent, lots of good continuity. And as we roll it around in real view, things look pretty good. Even if we turn on our curvature, things look pretty good. We have a little bit of problem here, but the major areas where there needs to be good continuity look pretty good. So let's take So per my suggestion in working with industrial designers, let's take this same model over into Rhino. And so I have Rhino loaded here in the background, and let me bring it up here with this model. And so I've taken my SolidWorks model, stepped it out, and stepped it into Rhino. And immediately you'll notice, and what the industrial designer would notice, that there's a bit of discontinuity going on right here near the end of this trigger. You can't see this in SolidWorks. It's the way that Rhino shades their models. And one of the factors there that I think is pretty interesting in Rhino, unlike SolidWorks, when you rotate your model, your lights are stationary, but your model space is rotating. So this kind of acts as an analysis tool. As you rotate things around, the lights are smooth over the surface. So knowing some of these issues, and there's kind of an issue like right up in this corner here, but we're going to ignore that for the time being. I'm going to go back with this new insight from Rhino. I'm going to go back to SolidWorks, and I'm going to start working to make that connection better in that area. So what I've done is I have this one version that I just showed you, but I also have a better version of it where I've gone back in to this area and I've cleaned it up. I've made it a little bit more continuous here. And, we can maybe see that improvement if we use our analysis tools like curvature or zebras. But really we need to kind of put it back into Rhino and compare it with our last version. So I'm going to do that, go back over to the Rhino, and let's go ahead and let's import that new version. So I'm going to go here, find the better surface quality version of the step. Let me just filter step here so I can find it more easily. And let's keep it joined. And then in our front view of Rhino, we'll just take white selected and we'll move it off to the front of this other version so that we can get a comparison. Right about there, that's fine. Okay, and let's go back to our perspective window. And you can see right away that we have made an improvement. So if you just concentrate on this area, this was the troubled area, and you can see how we're able to smooth it out here much better. Another thing too is that the analysis tools are much better in Rhino than they are in SolidWorks. For instance, on curvature, if we go to surface analysis by curvature, display analysis, and we pick these surfaces, you can see that the key here is that we can actually change the range of curvature. Now in SolidWorks it's just set, and it's set to some kind of overall bounding size of the model, which can be a little confusing. So here in Rhino you can actually set the values, and so if I just want to make it a little looser value, I can go 175 up and minus 175 down and get a little different display. But you can see immediately, you can do auto range and max range too, by the way. You can see that, just put it on auto range here to get back to where I wanted to be to show you what I want to show. So you can see that the difference between these two solutions, I'm getting a little bit better continuity between this trigger area and this transition area. And that's where you can just really get down to the brass tacks on what the surface is doing because of Rhino's evaluation tools. I mean, it not only has the curvature, obviously, but we can also take a look at it through zebra and many other types of analysis. And then there's also curve analysis. So anyway, that's always been a real successful step for me to take when working with industrial designers, is to bring it into Rhino and negotiate and talk over the execution in Rhino instead of SolidWorks. So just a few more tips to wrap up this episode. These are some of the talking points that I've had with industrial designers as we negotiate the execution of the design. Some of the first things I might ask, even before we get into their design or I get into CAD, is what will be the product's surface finish or color. This affects the way that you execute in that if you have very smooth and shiny surfaces, metallic, black, or white, this can have a real impact on the quality of the continuity of the surfaces that you create in SolidWorks. So if the product is more of a matte finish or a texture finish on a Moldtec 11,000, 10, 20, or 30, then it's not so much of an issue, and you can probably execute your design with the just tangent continuity between your surfaces. But it's important that you might have a mix of both those, so you just need to negotiate with the designer what areas are going to be affected by that given their finish. What part of the design elements are most important to the industrial designer? This way you can focus on what's most important to them in the design and maybe not focus so much on other areas. Sometimes we make assumptions about what's important, and it's just better to go right to the source and get that out on the table in the front, and that way you can work more effectively. It tends to be that a lot of times industrial design takes the stance that everything has to be curve continuous, and this is where negotiation comes in on what needs to be C2 and what doesn't. A lot of times when radiuses are below 2, maybe even 3 millimeters, it's not really important that the radius be a curve continuous fillet. You never see it, even in high gloss surfaces, because the detail is so small. So I think it's just a matter of educating the industrial designer on that. But in some cases where the fillet is a key design intent, you want to be faithful to execute the industrial designer's intent. And then early on, or as early as you can see in the design, start to identify some of the risky areas that might be imposed by the industrial design. So that would be like thick wall sections, minimum draft, a minimum appearance gap. You know that tooling everything's toleranced, and the bigger the tool, the greater the shrink rate, and this is why we do details like appearance gaps and whatnot. On the subject of reoccurring tension that I've observed in my experience in the role of both an ID and an ME, one factor stands out to me, and I thought I'd mention it here. In some situations in the early stages of a product design, no one really knows the projected product's price point and at what kind of volumes per year the product is going to be projected for. And I'm saying this is for some situations. Many situations it's well established, but traditionally establishing the product requirements through a PRD of what the quantity per year cost, retail cost is, it is done pretty well by well-established product development companies. But I've observed that in Silicon Valley, that many startups, usually coming from a software development background, don't do the due diligence to establish a proper PRD or MRD. And this can lead to tension in the conceptual phase, since more times than not, because without a refined target price and volume, anything and everything is on the table as far as materials and manufacturing processes. I find that the most successful product development programs are the ones where marketing has created a clear MRD and or PRD in the early stages that can clearly articulate the competition, the target market, and the projected cost and volume of the product. So this is probably my most controversial slide in the deck because I know that some of you will take issue with some of these observations or take them personally even. Know that these are not meant as a universal statement, but for some of you, and in my experience, I've seen a repeated pattern. So I thought it'd be worth mentioning some of these. And sometimes when I work with ID partners and clients, I see that there's too much of a focus on how it looks over how well it functions day to day. In other words, they're focused on the point of purchase, but past that, everyday use is not so important to them. And I would submit that that is important because how well the product functions leads to repeat sales and success of the product. So I think that's something that just can't be ignored. And sometimes the point of purchase appearance and attributes of the product, it sacrifices the long-term use, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I also see that some MEs are reluctant to experiment with new and less proven manufacturing methods because of the pending schedule and resource pressures. Now, this is a real problem because the ME is starting in the product development cycle is coming up against dates and schedules, and so they may be driven by those pretty heavily. And so I can really empathize with that. Whereas the industrial designer, they're on the very front end, right? And there's a whole months of schedule out in front of them. I would just say that just let the program manager know that you want to be involved as if you're an ME towards the beginning of the project to get involved earlier so that you can properly experiment and not be forced into just executing in the middle of the road. Sometimes I see that IDs don't allow themselves enough budget and schedule to do the proper prototyping and user experience testing. Again, it's kind of like with the first item, it's all a focus on how it looks. And I can appreciate that because that's a huge role that ID has, but there's other aspects of the product, namely user experience, that needs to be tested. And a lot of times you just can't do that by virtualizing in a vision of it. You have to actually get it in front of users. So building prototypes is really important, and using those prototypes in user experience is extremely important feedback. MEs sometimes are not sensitive to competitive innovation that the ID brings to the table. And that's so important for the product's eventual success. So many products are not, they're not uniquely innovative, but they're competitive. That is, they're competing against an existing idea and trying to improve on that that idea. So really, the contribution by the ID becomes extremely important in those situations because that's what's going to make or break success of this new competitive product. And also I see both IDs and MEs are not willing or feel capable to learn more engineering and design respectively. They're kind of like siloed into their respective roles, and maybe they feel that they don't have the right to learn more about industrial design if you're ME, and for IDs to feel like they're not worthy to know more engineering so that they can support their innovation. I would just say, forget that. Just you're going to learn what you're going to learn, and you'll learn a lot more if you're open to how far you can go. So it's some of the best IDs I've seen, like I said earlier, are the ones that really go out, do the research, learn, and build on their knowledge to create better and more innovative designs. So that's about all we have time for today in today's episode. So I hope I brought some insight to this subject, and one that not many people really want to talk about, but many of you I feel are aware of. And like I'd said before, it'd be great to continue the conversation so that we can just learn more about it and bring it out in the open. Just know this in the end, that both the ID and ME want the same thing. I think that's walking into a store one day and seeing the object of their creation. I know for me, nothing brings more satisfaction and bragging rights than the statement, "I made this." So thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. We hope what you've learned has been informative and can help you to better use some of SolidWorks' advanced features. You'll see in the YouTube description a link to example models used in today's video. Feel free to download it, and you can explore these techniques at your own leisure. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so consider emailing me at the address you see here on the screen. If you need help on your design project or just want to know more about us, stop by our website at spannerpd.com or email us at hello@spannerpd.com. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.